The United States is now pumping out more oil than ever, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Russia. Oil fields across Texas and North Dakota are operating at full throttle. By the numbers, America has become the top oil producer in the world. That should spell enormous profits, global leverage, and energy dominance, right? Despite hitting record production, U.S. oil companies have been losing money. Their profits are falling. Oil tankers sit unused. Buyers worldwide are pulling back. It's as if global demand for American oil suddenly vanished. This isn't just a case of poor luck or market timing. A political decision played a major role. Former President Donald Trump initiated a trade war intended to strengthen the U.S. economy. But instead it triggered a worldwide ripple effect, one that hit America's oil industry in its most vulnerable spot. And this story is bigger than oil. It's about energy, influence, trade networks, and even how we'll power our cars in the future. Because while the U.S. was fighting to control oil markets, something else was gaining momentum: electric vehicles. The EV surge was quietly reshaping the global energy equation. So how did America go from energy powerhouse to struggling seller in just a few years? Let's rewind to the moment it all seemed like a success story. To understand the collapse, we need to look back to a time when the U.S. oil sector felt invincible. Between 2016 and 2018, the country was in the midst of what was hailed as the shale revolution. New extraction methods, particularly fracking, unlocked oil reserves that had once been out of reach. Small towns in places like Texas and North Dakota exploded with drilling rigs, transforming overnight. Production soared to unprecedented levels. By 2018, the U.S. had overtaken every other country to become the largest oil producer. Some estimates showed output exceeding 12 million barrels per day. This gave the U.S. something it hadn't had in decades: real geopolitical power. American oil started showing up in Europe, Asia, even China. For the first time since the 1970s, the U.S. was a significant exporter. Analysts called it a new era for U.S. energy. Investors flooded in. Industry leaders talked confidently about energy dominance. It felt inevitable. But under the surface, problems were brewing. Global oil demand growth had already begun to slow. Prices were unstable. And the whole system depended heavily on international buyers. Without them, all that oil had no destination. In 2018, President Trump launched a sweeping trade offensive, mainly aimed at nations he accused of exploiting the U.S., chiefly China and the EU. The plan imposed tariffs to protect American industries. But trade wars have consequences, and for oil they were swift and severe. China, once America's top oil buyer, didn't just complain, they retaliated. Practically overnight, they slashed U.S. oil imports by 90%. One month, tankers were welcomed. The next, they were turned away. Imagine running a restaurant where your biggest customer suddenly stops showing up. That's exactly what happened. In 2017, U.S. oil exports to China peaked near 500,000 barrels per day. By the end of 2018, that number had plummeted. The data looked like someone pulled the plug on a booming business, and China wasn't alone. The EU and others responded with tariffs of their own, further choking U.S. energy exports. Timing couldn't have been worse. Just as America's oil sector was ramping up to lead the world, its biggest markets shut the door. This wasn't just politics. It was a direct hit to an industry that believed it was untouchable. And what followed next was a chain reaction. After China dropped U.S. oil, the rest of the world took notice. Suddenly, American crude wasn't seen as a stable choice. India slowed its purchases. Even Europe, which had once turned to the U.S. to reduce its reliance on Russian oil, started hesitating. They didn't want to get caught in the middle of a trade fight, so they shifted course. Instead of buying from the U.S., they turned to other producers: Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia. These countries were quick to fill the gap. Russia, especially, offered steep discounts on its oil, like its Ural grade. It wasn't as clean-burning as American crude, but it was cheaper and came with fewer political risks. This forced buyers to choose deal with unpredictable U.S. policies or take stable, discounted oil elsewhere. The result? U.S. oil lost its pricing edge. It no longer looked like a winning option. This wasn't just a hit to revenue, it was a credibility crisis. If buyers couldn't rely on U.S. oil, they wouldn't commit to long-term contracts or investments. And once the customers started pulling back, the debt problem began surfacing. During the boom years, shale companies had borrowed massive sums to expand quickly. The assumption, high oil prices and steady demand would cover those loans. But once prices fell and buyers disappeared, the math broke down. Profits that were supposed to repay those debts began to vanish. Companies found themselves underwater, deep in debt, and suddenly, cash-starved. Investors got nervous. Wall Street began retreating. Company after company folded. Perhaps the most iconic was Chesapeake Energy. A pioneer in fracking, it had been a symbol of the shale era. By 2020, overwhelmed by debt and dropping prices, it filed for bankruptcy. It was a warning sign. The U.S. oil sector had overreached, grown too fast, borrowed too much, and failed to plan for instability. Meanwhile, rivals saw an opportunity. With U.S. shale faltering, OPEC+, led by Saudi Arabia and Russia, made their move. In early 2020, a dispute between them escalated into a full-blown price war. Instead of cutting production to stabilize prices, they both flooded the market with cheap oil. They knew American producers needed oil to stay above $50 or $60 a barrel to remain profitable. They pushed prices down to $30, then below $20. It was a deliberate strategy. Saudi Arabia and Russia could afford to wait it out. Their costs were lower and their governments backed them. The U.S. couldn't keep up. More companies collapsed, rigs were shut down, jobs disappeared. Just as the U.S. was sidelined, another force was quietly building momentum. Even before COVID-19, something had started shifting. By 2019, oil demand growth was slowing, not because of supply, but because of changing habits. EV adoption was surging in Europe and China. Subsidies, tax incentives, and infrastructure made switching from gas cars easy, and people embraced it. In Norway, EVs made up over half of new car sales. In China, sales passed 1.2 million in 2019. Dozens of new models hit the market. Countries began announcing bans on gas-powered cars, because transportation is the biggest reason we use oil. If electric vehicles become the norm, demand for gasoline nosedives, and oil companies lose their primary customers. Investors took notice. Money flowed out of fossil fuels and into clean tech. The oil industry wasn't just facing political and pricing chaos, it was facing irrelevance. Then came the final hit, COVID-19. As the pandemic spread in 2020, lockdowns froze global movement. Planes were grounded, roads emptied, factories went dark. Demand for oil collapsed overnight. Storage tanks filled, pipelines clogged, tankers drifted at sea with nowhere to unload. Then came a historic shock. On April 20th, 2020, the price of West Texas Intermediate oil fell to negative $37 per barrel. Sellers were literally paying buyers to take oil off their hands. It was a surreal moment, symbolizing just how broken the system had become. But remember, COVID didn't start this crisis. It only magnified it. Trade wars, global competition, and the EV shift were already shaking the foundation. The pandemic just accelerated the collapse. Even as the world began recovering, the U.S. oil sector was left facing a new era and new challenges. When former President Joe Biden took office, a major shift began in U.S. energy policy. Unlike Trump, who pushed for oil dominance and stripped away regulations to make drilling easier, Biden's focus turned toward climate action, clean energy, and cutting carbon emissions. Biden's team reintroduced environmental reviews, paused new drilling leases on federal land, and increased scrutiny on permits. These moves didn't kill oil outright, but they did slow things down, making it tougher, pricier, and slower to expand operations. Then came a turning point, the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. This law was packed with clean energy incentives, billions in subsidies for electric vehicles, wind and solar power, and battery production. For investors, the signal was loud and clear. Green energy was the future. Money started shifting. Wall Street, once deep in oil, pivoted fast, pouring capital into EV startups, batteries, and hydrogen tech. Even traditional oil giants like ExxonMobil and Chevron started investing in carbon capture and low-carbon fuels, not out of goodwill, but necessity. Auto companies jumped in too. Ford and GM revealed massive EV plans, chasing Tesla and aiming to meet stricter emissions targets. All of this put extra pressure on U.S. oil. Even if producers could pump more, the long-term demand picture looked shaky. Government policy was now clearly steering the market away from fossil fuels. For the oil industry, this wasn't just about new rules. It was about identity, what role oil would play in the future. And that contrast became even clearer when you looked at the global EV leader, China. China has become the heavyweight in the EV race, and its rise highlights the widening gap. In just a few years, China poured huge investments into EV production, battery tech, and charging stations. This wasn't just about cars. It was a blueprint for an entire clean energy ecosystem. Today, China accounts for nearly one-third of global EV sales, more than any other country. Homegrown companies like BYD and NIO lead in innovation and affordability, often outpacing Western rivals. At the same time, China has steadily cut back its U.S. oil imports, especially after the trade war started. Instead, it sources crude from Russia, the Middle East, and local production. China's EV boom is slowly but surely shrinking the need for American oil. While U.S. producers struggle to find buyers, China's surging EV market continues to reduce its demand for gasoline and diesel. On one side, the U.S. oil industry is fighting declining demand and rising debt. On the other, China is racing toward a clean energy future. This isn't just a short-term trend. It's a major global shift in how power is generated and consumed. And as China rises, other players are adjusting too. Russia and Saudi Arabia, two longtime energy giants, saw the U.S. stumble and quietly stepped up. Russia, facing sanctions, turned to a shadow fleet of tankers, vessels operating outside normal regulations. These ships made covert transfers at sea, keeping Russian oil flowing to buyers in Asia and Europe, often at big discounts. Meanwhile, Saudi Arabia leveraged its stable, low-cost production to sign long-term deals with countries like China and India. With OPEC plus managing supply cuts, Riyadh offered buyers predictability, something U.S. shale couldn't match. These deals weren't just about price. They were about stability and long-term energy security. Together, Russia and Saudi Arabia filled the gap the U.S. left behind, building deeper ties in Asia and securing their roles in a new energy order. While American companies watched their markets shift east, these two players cemented their influence with strategic investments in ports, pipelines, and refineries. But even as geopolitics played out, another force was gaining speed: the electric revolution. At the center of this transformation was Tesla. While other automakers hesitated, Tesla surged ahead. It built massive battery plants, slashed EV prices, and set new benchmarks for performance. In 2020, Tesla unveiled its 4680 battery cell, promising better range and lower cost. Think of it as replacing your car's engine with a battery that's more powerful and takes up less space. Suddenly, EVs could go over 300 miles and recharge in the time it takes to grab coffee. Tesla also adopted LFP batteries for many of its models, sacrificing a bit of range for gains in safety, lifespan, and affordability. That opened the door for more drivers to make the switch. This sparked a domino effect. Legacy automakers launched their own EV lines, built battery plants, and raced to cut prices. In key markets, EVs are now cheaper than some gas models, undermining oil's grip on transportation. With Tesla leading, oil's role in daily driving began to slip away. So can U.S. oil make a comeback? Only if a narrow set of conditions are met. One path is political. A future administration could cancel tariffs, reopen foreign markets, and remove drilling restrictions. That might lower costs and rekindle global demand, but it would take time. Meanwhile, competitors aren't waiting. Another path is regulatory. Streamlining permits and fast-tracking pipelines could help producers scale up faster, but even that's a short-term fix, because demand is still fading. Then there's innovation. Some oil giants are betting on carbon capture, technology that traps CO2 from emissions and stores it underground. If it works at scale, oil might earn a cleaner label and attract investors again. But that tech is still experimental and years from being mainstream. Finally, there's the wild card: hydrogen. Some believe natural gas could power a new wave of hydrogen fuels, clean enough to run trucks, ships, or power plants. If the U.S. takes the lead here, it could pivot its fossil fuel base. But green hydrogen, powered by renewables, is already gaining ground. Add it all up, and the path back for U.S. oil is extremely narrow. It would take timely policy shifts, real tech breakthroughs, and a bit of luck. And even then, the world may have already moved on. Because when you take a step back, this isn't just an oil slump. It's a turning point in global energy. For over 100 years, oil and gas powered the world. But now new sources, solar, wind, EVs, are forging a new path. Even if oil rebounds briefly, the current is flowing in a new direction. Big forecasters like BP predict global oil demand will peak this decade and never fully recover. Automakers from Ford to VW are planning all-electric lineups by 2035. Governments are aiming for net zero emissions. Investors are redirecting trillions into renewables. Far more than oil companies can muster. In short, even if oil sees short bursts of revival, the long-term momentum is slipping away. The tipping point has passed. Demand is softening, alternatives are scaling, and clean energy is now at the center of future policy. For American oil, this means production alone won't be enough. The world isn't waiting, it's already planning a future beyond oil. So now the big question, was Trump's trade war the moment that tipped the scale, or just the first spark in a bigger transformation? The International Energy Agency says oil demand is lower today largely due to ongoing risks from trade tariffs. Others point to how Saudi Arabia's strategic price moves, coinciding with Trump's visits, highlighted oil's vulnerability to politics. Data from April 2025 shows continued stress in the U.S. economy. Goldman Sachs notes how Trump's swings, from demanding cheap fuel for consumers to backing producers, added instability that scared off investors. U.S. shale may have peaked. Drilling has slowed. Production fell for the first time outside the pandemic years. Experts argue Trump's tariffs damage key alliances and supply chains, creating long-term fallout in energy markets. At the same time, think tanks like CSI warn that without easing trade restrictions, U.S.-China trade will keep shrinking, hurting oil exports even further. Executives once bullish on a Trump-led oil boom are now worried about recession risk and weak recovery. But this story isn't over. Some oil companies are experimenting with cleaner tech. Regulations could shift again, geopolitical tensions could realign markets. Still, what's clear is that between tariffs, rising competition, and the EV surge, oil's future looks fundamentally different. So what do you think? Was the trade war the real trigger, or just one of many catalysts behind oil's fall? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't miss our next video, How Big Oil is Trying to Kill EVs, where we dive into the industry's latest strategies to hold back the clean energy wave.